So, I'm recording this episode before D23 begins to explain why this event matters in terms of shaping the future of the Disney company. Also, we'll talk about what to look for at the event itself. We'll focus this episode mostly on the parks. In other episodes, we'll explore film and other entertainments. But buckle up, because today, we'll take a look at why this event is so important to the company, especially after a deeply lackluster 2022 Expo when Bob Chapek's team announced next to nothing of deep value in terms of generating new visitation for the Florida and California resorts. In retrospect, most every executive in the C-suite back in 2022 likely knew that the real plan was to use profits from the parks for the foreseeable future to backfill losses from the Disney Plus streaming service, as the expansion to that product was not handled well by Disney management. The end result, at least in terms of the parks, was that no large projects were being greenlit to open between 2024 and 2026, which would have clear negative effects on park visitation and hotel occupancy. And this left current CEO Bob Iger in a position where he not only needed to correct the management of the streaming service, but somehow undo, or more accurately, minimize the damage inflicted on the parks by the previous CEO, Bob Chapek. So, in our lead up to the D23 event today, we'll look at the overall problems that the Disney team needs to overcome to make this a successful event for both fans and probably now more importantly for investors. The surface of D23 is a fan celebration, complete with cosplay parades and unique merchandise. But beneath the veneer, there are some genuine struggles churning away inside the company, as evidenced by another round of layoffs that were announced only a few days before the event was set to begin. So, if you're ready, let's go. Let's start in an unusual place with the Comcast earnings call from July 23rd, about 2 weeks ago. Comcast is the owner of Universal and the Universal Parks, and it's not just Disney that's having a slow year in terms of park attendance. On the call, Michael Cavanaugh, president of Comcast, said, "Our results were down in both revenue and EBITDA when compared to last year's record performance, with 2/3 of the decline driven by lower attendance at our domestic parks." Revenue there was down 11%, and earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization was down by 24%. And this generally is how theme parks work. There's a fixed base cost to open a theme park on any given day. Once you cover that fixed cost, a greater portion of additional revenue is earnings or profits. So if your revenue is up 10%, it may mean your earnings or profits are up by double that. And if your revenue is down by 10%, your earnings or profits may be down by about 20%. But here comes the concerning part. Cavanaugh explained that after the pandemic, Universal saw a higher number of guests in its parks, essentially families who put off vacations during COVID. That wave has now ended. He also pointed to two other reasons that, in his opinion, contributed to downward visitation at the Universal parks. First, the increasing attractiveness of cruises, and second, the strong U.S. dollar that made traveling to foreign countries less expensive. Specifically, he said, more recently, other travel options, including cruises and international tourism, given the strength of the dollar, have experienced their own surge in demand, which caused visitation rates at our parks to normalize. And it is that last word which is causing concern. As these comments were pre-planned and vetted by lawyers and other executives, he didn't slip in a word choice in presenting Universal's opinion of upcoming attendance trends. He was suggesting that without significant incentives, he believed that the current level of visitation would be the new normal, at least for a while moving forward. But Universal also believes that they have a plan to improve the current normalized attendance levels, and that plan is focused on a new park, Epic Universe. In the earnings call, it became clear that unlike Disney, Universal sees attendance strongly tied to centerpiece attractions. This is a quote from Jason Armstrong, who is the CFO for Comcast. This is the first full quarter comparison to the highly successful opening of Super Nintendo World in Hollywood early last year, which drove that park's record results in the second quarter of last year. And we haven't launched a major new attraction in Orlando since Velocicoaster in 2021 in anticipation of Epic Universe, which we originally planned to open this year. The key part here is what Armstrong highlights in terms of an attendance driver. Between 2021 and 2024, Universal Orlando premiered a new parade, specifically the Mega Movies Parade. They have premiered a new nighttime lagoon show, specifically Cinesational, which is an impressive show. They've also premiered a minor DreamWorks Land arranged for kids, which was a retheming of the old Kid Zone, and they've premiered what I would call a C-ticket family ride based on the Minions franchise and VillainCon. But Universal, in their statement, doesn't list any of these as meaningful attendance drivers. Instead, they look back to a large, expensive thrill ride that premiered in 2021. Another element that Comcast didn't list as a compelling driver of attendance, hotel and park ticket discounts, both of which Disney has relied on since the end of 2023. And in all of this, there's some troubling news here for Disney. Most of what Disney presently has announced for its Florida parks falls into categories that Universal identifies, at least in terms of their own parks, as attraction categories that don't meaningfully move the attendance needle. Disney is retheming It's Tough to Be a Bug into a revamped attraction featuring Zootopia, much like Universal revamped Woody Woodpecker's Kid Zone with DreamWorks properties such as Shrek and Trolls. There's also been many rumors of a new nighttime parade coming to the Magic Kingdom, though the Disney parades tend to be more spectacular than those at Universal. This at least would fall generally into the same category as Universal's Mega Movies Parade. And as a side note, the Magic Kingdom is the park that needs the least help in terms of attendance at the moment. The park that needs the most help is Animal Kingdom. Disney has revamped the Little Mermaid stage show coming to Hollywood Studios, which again I would say is a C-ticket attraction. Disney is also upgrading Test Track at Epcot. The ride system and track layout, as far as I know, will remain the same, but the visual theme will be swapped out. The practice here of deep rethemes of show stage attractions is more of a Disney thing than a Universal thing. Universal typically raises their show areas and simply starts over. But to put all of this simply, many of the things that Disney has announced and will likely appear in 2025 fall into general categories that Universal is indicating don't meaningfully increase attendance, at least at their theme parks. And maybe there was some verbal sparring in these comments arranged to make Universal appear to have what it would take to increase attendance in 2025 and 2026, and to make it seem as though Disney likely did not have these things. But if so, it's not all hype. On the earnings call, Universal gave 4 examples of what they believed would increase attendance. The Miniland arranged around a unique roller coaster in its park in Japan, specifically Donkey Kong Country, the Fast and Furious roller coaster at its California park, the already opened Velocicoaster in Florida, and the yet-to-be-opened and running slightly behind construction schedule, Epic Universe, also in Florida. Projects of this scale, Universal is indicating, increase attendance, while smaller projects like shows and parades likely create higher guest satisfaction. But those smaller projects don't incentivize families, or at least they don't incentivize a lot of families, to arrange a vacation in Florida. Admittedly, there are differences between the guest profile for a person visiting Universal compared to guest profiles for those who regularly visit Disney World. Deep Disney fans, in my experience, are more likely to show up for a smaller event or a new show. Disney also has one other driver to spike return attendance, which is DVC. This is one of the reasons that Disney keeps building new DVC expansions on property at a far quicker rate than they open cash hotels. In its resort ecosystem, Disney divides its Disney-owned on-property hotels into two categories. Cash hotels, essentially guests who pay cash to stay in a room. Former CEO Michael Eisner leaned heavily into cash hotels during his time with the company, which was between 1984 and 2004. Admittedly, the Disney Vacation Club, or DVC, didn't actually begin until 1991, but still, during Eisner's time as CEO, the vast majority of hotel projects were cash hotels. Specifically, 15 hotel projects versus 4 DVC projects. That's the Grand Floridian all the way up through Pop Century. And there are only 4 DVC properties that fall under Eisner's watch. Old Key West, which was originally called simply the Disney Vacation Club, Boardwalk Villas, Beach Club Villas, and Saratoga Springs. Under Bob Iger's time as CEO, the company has focused far more on DVC properties as a way of creating return visits. During Iger's time, the Florida resort opened one cash hotel, which is the Grand Destino Tower, and 8 DVC projects, from the villas over at Animal Kingdom Lodge up through the cabins at Fort Wilderness. And this doesn't even include the sizable expansion to the Grand Floridian DVC villas in 2022, or the Poly Tower, which will open this coming December. And we could quibble if the Galactic Star Cruiser qualifies as a hotel or not, but since it's closed, we don't even need to have that conversation. And I also know that cash guests can at times book DVC rooms. There's a complicated answer as to why this is, but basically when a DVC hotel opens, very few of the rooms have been purchased by guests or are available to current DVC members. So Disney holds future DVC inventory rooms as cash rooms and slowly shifts them over as contracts are sold to DVC. For example, when the new Poly Tower opens this coming December, only 40 rooms in the entire building will be available to DVC members. That's about 15% of the tower. And over half of these rooms will either be duo or deluxe studios. The rest of the rooms initially will be held as cash rooms and slowly shifted over as contract sales come in. And beyond this, at times when occupancy is low, cash guests can find some space in DVC rooms, but this is a minor part of the overall business. But still, these two elements, deeper guest attachment, at least for some guests, to the Disney brand, and leasehold ownership of DVC timeshares on property, encouraging repeat business, is not enough to keep the parks full. One of the issues here, if DVC members aren't interested in visiting on any given year, they can just rent out their points to other people, which in turn then lowers interest in Disney cash hotels. There's a handful of companies online who specialize in this. But here's the point. The magazine Forbes has estimated that there are just over 250,000 DVC owners, with most of them having home resorts in Florida. But that is nowhere near enough to fill the parks. Let's say that those 250,000 owners on average book a room or villa for 3 people. Sure, some of these rooms can accommodate more, but when I go, I often go by myself. So as best I understand it, it typically averages out to about 3 people per reservation. Let's say that on average, each of these DVC owners makes 1 vacation a year. And yes, some go more than that, and some book and bank to go every other or every 3rd year. And if you're listening to this podcast, there's a reasonable chance that you're in the group that goes more than once a year. But let's say that on average, it's once a year. Just over 250,000 owners, with most having home resorts in Florida and 3 people per reservation, comes out to around 750,000 people per year on property through DVC, maybe a little less to account for the resorts in California, Hawaii, South Carolina, and at Vero Beach, but probably somewhere between 700,000 and 750,000 people in that reservation group. And here's the problem. On a good year, such as 2019, the Magic Kingdom sees nearly 21 million visitors. During the most recent year, when TEA estimated visitation, which was 2022, the Magic Kingdom saw 17 million visitors. So DVC, though important to the company, accounts for only a small percentage of overall visitation to the Florida parks. Let's say that some DVC guests might visit the Magic Kingdom twice on one vacation, so let's pin DVC participation at somewhere between 5 and 6% of those people overall who visit the parks. And this right here is part of the larger problem. Disney, not through DVC, brand loyalty, or new attractions, doesn't presently have the right levers to increase park attendance in 2024 or 2025 at Florida or in California. And that brings us into the next section. And then, early on the morning of August 7th, Disney had its quarterly earnings call with some surprises in the mix. The surprising news was that the Disney streaming business was able to show a small profit of $47 million compared to a loss of $500 million this time last year. Whether Disney Plus, along with its sister streamers, can continually show a profit is something to watch moving forward. But the streamer wasn't expected to show any profit until the end of the fourth quarter in a few months. Add into this the strong showing of Inside Out 2, which we've already talked about here on the podcast, and Deadpool and Wolverine, though revenue from that Marvel film will post to the next quarter. Entertainment finally had a strong quarter. Disney posted per-share earnings of $1.39, which is 20 cents above the Wall Street expectations. Overall, revenue as well was slightly above expectations. Yet, investors didn't like this overall earnings report. When the stock market opened, Disney was down 3%, falling from $90 per share down to $88 per share. At the time that I write this, midday on October 7th, the stock is down a little bit more at $86.83, which means overall the trend is going lower. And the reason for this is simple. One headline for a CNN business article put it succinctly. Their headline read, "Disney may have a parks problem." Or if you prefer traditional newspapers, the headline for the LA Times read, "Disney's streaming business turns profit, but parks show signs of trouble." And it's not the international parks they're talking about. Income from the international parks was up by 2%. It's the American parks where income was down 6%. For decades, investors have seen these parks in particular as a solid and reliable income and growth area in the company. When the streamer was losing money, Chapek essentially shifted profits from the parks over to Disney Plus to backfill the losses. And the split between international and domestic parks makes even more sense when you look at new attractions overseas. The Frozen-themed land at Hong Kong, where Disney is a 48% owner of the resort. The Zootopia-themed land at Shanghai, where Disney is a 43% owner of the resort. And though Tokyo Disney Seas is owned and operated by the OLC, even there they saw Fantasy Springs. Nothing comparable happened this past year at the stateside Disney parks. Disney, compared to Universal, had slightly different reasons for the downturn in revenue. Like Universal, they pointed to higher earning families using this time with the strong dollar to take advantage of international vacations. But they also pointed to economic stress as the reason some mid to lower income families aren't visiting their parks. And for clarity, this is exactly what Universal, with a new park opening next year, doesn't want to hear. That a difficult economic U.S. outlook might dissuade middle-class families from making a trip to Orlando. Outside of this on the call, Disney executives seemed clear as to the size and scope of the actual problem. About the domestic parks, company CFO Hugh Johnson said, "So we saw a slight moderation in demand. I certainly wouldn't call it a significant change." I would generally agree with this. A 6% downturn is meaningful, especially considering how deeply discounted certain tickets and rooms are at the moment. But I believe the message here is exactly what Comcast stated earlier. Parks without large new attractions or lands will see attendance decline. And Disney seemed to understand this finally by repeatedly saying that growth in the American parks would be turbocharged. For fans of the park, this may actually be positive news. This means that the Disney company at the moment is financially incentivized to approve large improvements to the Florida and California resorts, though of course these large improvements will take years to design, plan, build, and open. Hugh Johnson also said, "We expect to see a flattish revenue number in Q4 coming out of the parks. And as we mentioned earlier in the letter, really just a few quarters. So I don't think I'd referred to it as protracted, just a couple of quarters of likely similar results." And here I might disagree with Hugh Johnson. I think it'll take more than a couple of quarters to turn this around. For a while now on this podcast, we've been saying that 2027 seems like a likely year to begin to see some of these improvements open to the public. And this was even hinted at the call, when an analyst challenged him about a timeline for growth, specifically concerning the parks. Johnson said, "Now keep in mind that the lead time on investments in this business are multiple years." But to be clear, I myself fully believe that with the right investments in the parks, this trend can shift probably relatively soon. And by soon, again, I mean somewhere around 2027. Or to put this directly, the incentives that need to be in place to drive higher attendance in the parks likely can't be there until around 2027 under ideal conditions. I will say that one of the elements I found interesting in the third quarter material was this. In the earnings presentation under the heading of Avatar, Disney included the Avatar experience coming to the Disneyland Resort. But under the Marvel heading, there was no mention of any Avengers attraction, such as that King Thanos ride hyped a couple of years ago, being developed for DCA. Which might tell you how little, if anything, has been developed on that experience so far. But to get back to where we started today, Universal recently released a video preview of another land inside of Epic Universe, which shows how, assuming this economy stays reasonably strong, Universal hopes to significantly boost their parks' revenue beyond what they described as the new normal. The land featured in this new preview video was themed to the wizarding world of Harry Potter, and this announcement was clearly timed to undercut any announcement that Disney might make at the D23 event later this week. The new Potter land, at least its exteriors, are themed to 1920s Paris, to the era of Fantastic Beasts. This area will be larger than the French Pavilion at Epcot, though clearly there are some similarities. The land will feature a restaurant, shops, and indoor circus show arranged around the Fantastic Beasts franchise, as well as one high-concept attraction based around the Ministry of Magic. This is a ride that, in a smaller format, was originally considered to be added to the existing Diagon Alley section of Universal, but it was shifted over to Epic Universe, where designers would have more space and money to develop the attraction. And the show building for this ride now appears to be the largest attraction area inside of Epic. Though the land itself is tied to Paris and the Fantastic Beasts films, which take place in the 1920s, the main attraction would take guests traveling through the Metroflues, and also likely through time dimensions, to the time of Harry Potter, likely in the late 1990s, when Harry, Hermione, and Ron are still central characters in the drama for the trial of Dolores Umbridge in England, to put this in straightforward terms. Though the land here is tied to the story of Newt and Grindelwald, the ride is tied to the story of Harry and Voldemort, because far, far more people have either seen or read the Harry Potter stories than have seen the movies about Newt and Grindelwald. That the land moves between two different timelines within the same fictional universe, I don't think will matter to hardly anyone so long as the attraction is engaging. And as a side note, I do believe that there's an object lesson here for Disney Galaxy's Edge and, let's say, Darth Vader. In terms of the attraction, as a guest you'll enter through the Metroflux system, taking you from Paris to England, also from the 1920s to a period many decades later. The ride system will be arranged around elevator cars that look extremely similar to those at Disney's Tower of Terror. The ride cars will be on a motion base, creating forward movement, with the cars being able to lift, lower, and tilt. But unlike the Tower of Terror, this ride will have no final drop. Inside the elevator lift system, guests will move up, down, left, right, and forward to view different floors that will present different scenes of this story. That of Death Eaters helping Dolores Umbridge break free and attempt to use a time turner to bring back the era of Voldemort. And for Harry Potter fans, simply put aside that Dolores Umbridge and Voldemort had no strong connections, nor was she, at least publicly, a follower of Voldemort. Let's just say that, I don't know, their anti-Muggle-born political goals were in alignment, and, well, Voldemort was the more powerful of the two by a lot. In the books, Dolores Umbridge is interested in those who have power, especially those who are authoritarians. So maybe that justifies the plot for this ride, or maybe not, I'm not sure. But regardless, animatronic Death Eaters arrive to free Dolores Umbridge. Umbridge will be presented as an animatronic as well. But part of her body, particularly her face, will be an external projection. Over at Epcot in Frozen Ever After, the projected faces on the animatronics come from inside the figures, which make their faces appear hotter than the rest of the figure. This disparity calls attention to their constructedness. But for these animatronics at the new Harry Potter ride, the projections will be mapped from an exterior projector to make her face perfectly match the figure and seem entirely human. Essentially, a projector casting an image from across the room on a moving dimensional screen, which is the animatronic, which is a new way to think about realism in animatronic technology. Umbridge struggles to use a time turner to bring back the era of Voldemort, while Harry, Ron, and Hermione work to stop her, which escalates towards a final battle in the attraction, with all of us as guests following their actions through the Ministry of Magic building as the drama ensues. So this is an attraction with many compelling features: an inventive ride system, a new approach to animatronic presentations, an extension of the original Harry Potter books and films, many large show stage areas such as in The Rise of the Resistance, and a surrounding land keyed to 1920s France that is larger and likely more detailed than the French pavilion over at Epcot. And this is just one attraction inside one of the 5 lands at Epic Universe. And this here is why the D23 event matters this year. Because after the failed planning of Bob Chapek, Bob Iger and the Disney company finally need to have an answer, even if it's now delayed, to Universal to regain or maintain market share in Florida. And let me parse this out here a little more. For years, Disney fans have complained about a lack of deep investment in the parks. But at this point, that lack of investment is now materializing as a loss of revenue, which is something investors care about. It's now down to $85.63, which is about a 5% drop on a day when the Dow as a whole fell only about 0.5%. Again, to put this in succinct terms, domestic park revenue is down last quarter by 6%, which now contributed to the stock decline. A 6% drop, I would say, is manageable unless this decline continues. That, I'm guessing, is the real point of concern here. And also, for the first time in years, because the park sector is off, Disney will actually need to put together a robust plan to satisfy investors and to stave off future losses. And sadly, investors here have far more sway with the company than do fans. From a certain perspective, most park fans maybe should be a little grateful that this chain of events happened, because this now has the best chance of getting them what they really want: firm, bold investments in the parks. And investors, no doubt, will be looking to see if the announcements at the D23 event are enough to meaningfully increase attendance at the parks when those attraction areas are finished. But also, very little has yet been announced. And so this here is one of the key business backdrops to the announcements that should come this weekend at the Disney event in the Anaheim Convention Center. So if you're following on the floor at the convention center, or if you're following the news at home, you now have the major pieces of business pressure that Disney faces in terms of what it does and does not announce this week. Over years, I've talked to people who have assembled the park's presentation, where new attractions and lands are announced. I've been told that more than once at past expos, the presentation changed a day or even hours before it was given. It's now Thursday morning as I record this. The Disney stock has dipped a little more. It's down to $84.50 per share, with one of the major drags on the price being park revenue. I'm guessing that executives right now are closely looking at and perhaps slightly adjusting this year's park presentation to meet that concern. Hopefully there are good announcements over the coming weekend, but you never know. 2 years ago, despite expectations, very little of value was actually announced. So I suppose there's still that possibility. But this is generally where we are today. I'll be back next week, probably on Tuesday to talk about the parks announcements, and on Thursday to talk about the entertainment announcements and what they mean for the future of the Disney company. I'll be at the event and the presentations in person. The Parks panel won't be streamed this year. No doubt the announcements will be posted on websites and on social media as they happen, but we'll talk about what they mean and how they might change the future of the Disney company next week. Also, one of the things that rarely comes through in announcements is the crowd reaction. Like a focus group, this almost always indicates how well or how poorly a particular announcement is received as it relates to the attraction that's discussed. We'll talk about that as well, as crowd reaction is sometimes surprising to the people who are making the announcements. So we should have some interesting things to discuss in a few days. I will see you then. I'll be back next week with a pair of episodes, likely one on Tuesday on the parks announcements and another on Thursday about film and entertainment. But from today's episode, if you are following D23 announcements from home, you now have the keys to understand executive motivation as to what's likely to be announced and, more importantly, why. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next Tuesday and Thursday, this is Todd James Pierce.